Hi, my dragons. Well, here we are on Monday to go over the next chapter. You will still get a test this week, except it will be essay. It will be open book, open notes, open PowerPoints. You can use your Gleitman book, and you can use the PowerPoints from what we're going over and what we have been going over. The test, it'll be due, I'll put it in the Moodle so you'll see when it's due, but it'll be all essay. You'll have a choice of essays, and I think they'll be 20 points each or 25 points each, so you'll do either 4 or 5 of them. I'm going to ask that you do 5 citations. It can be 3 from any source that we've covered in class, and then 2 additional ones from outside readings or other textbooks or other types of sources. So 5 total that you will have to use when explaining your essay. But it'll be about the things that we've talked about since the last test. So let's get into learning. So learning is our next topic that we're going to talk about. And it's a really big topic, and it's a really long PowerPoint. So I'll probably do this in 2 or 3 sections, maybe more. We'll see. Anyway, so when we talk about learning, we're talking about any permanent change in behavior brought on by experience or practice. So when people learn something, part of their brain is changed, and then not all of it is changed by learning. Some of it is changed just simply because they mature in age. So the most famous one is actually someone who wasn't even a learning theorist, is actually someone who wasn't even a psychologist. This is a serendipitous finding. He was a physician who was studying digestion, and he was using dogs as the mammal model to study digestion, and he noticed something strange that happened. But he was a Russian, and he founded classical conditioning. This is what he discovered. So he learned how to make something that was reflexive, a response to a stimulus other than its natural stimulus. So when you're thirsty, you get water, that's it, but he found a way to pair it with something else and then find that, guess what, they are responding to it. So classical conditioning revolves around certain things. So the unconditioned stimulus, or the UCS, is something that naturally happens that leads to an involuntary response. If I were to put a burst of air into your eyes, you'd blink, okay? That's a reflex. You don't have to be taught to do that. Everybody does that. The unconditioned response is blinking, okay? The puff of air would be the unconditioned stimulus, and blinking would be the unconditioned response, because that's just a reflex. However, in classical conditioning, we have a conditioned stimulus, something that's not natural that would occur, and it becomes paired with the reflex, and then you have the regular response, which is blinking. So like if I took a bell and I rang the bell and then blew the puff of air into your eye, you'd blink. And then I did it again, bell, puff of air, blink, bell, puff of air, blink, and did it over and over and over again. Pretty soon I wouldn't need the puff of air to make you blink. I just have to do the bell and you'd stop blinking, okay? So that would be the conditioned response, which would be a response that is a natural response, blinking, but not to a natural reflex, okay? Now you're blinking at the sound of a bell, which is completely not normal and not reflexive. So that's basically how classical conditioning works. Pavlov did it with dogs. He paired a bell with food, and it got salivation. It's normal for a dog to salivate when it sees the food, starts to salivate, boom, food, salivation. Those 2 things are unconscious and reflexive. But when you pair that food with the bell and keep pairing it with the bell and then take the food away, once you hit the bell, it's going to start salivating. And that's not natural. Okay, so there you go. So that's a conditioned response, because now you're reacting naturally, unconditionally, unknowingly to something that is not something you're supposed to do that to. So we're not supposed to run after the ice cream truck or something like that, but you hear the music of the ice cream truck and then you start reacting, maybe even salivating or whatever, because it's the ice cream truck. And so that's not normal, but nevertheless you've been conditioned to respond that way. Also in learning, we have acquisition. Acquisition is repeated pairing of a natural stimulus and the unconscious stimulus, and then you acquire learning that way. So classical condition happens easily, and a neutral stimulus has to be paired with it to get that conditioned response, okay? So on slide 10, you see what happened exactly with classical condition. This one is using a metronome, as in music, to have the same thing that happened with Pavlov and the bell, so you can see how that works on slide 10. So the conditioned stimulus is something that is distinctive and it stands out from other kinds of things. You may have tried this with your pets, you know, like you have a dog and you're trying to get it to sit, and every time it sits you give it a treat. Okay, so eventually you get to the point where you can just say the word sit and it will sit down because it's anticipating a treat. Stimulus generalization is another thing that we found in learning theory, and that is when the stimuli or the response generalizes to other things, okay? So instead of going toward food, maybe it's going to, maybe you're going to have a response toward something else instead of just the food. So it covers a lot of different sorts of responses and different sorts of things that you're responding to. So for instance, if you have a pizza in front of you, then your mouth starts to water, right? And then if you are sitting down and you watch a commercial for Pizza Hut or Domino's or something like that, just seeing it on TV makes your mouth water. And then maybe another company comes on, like McDonald's or something, and you find, oh my God, it's happening for hamburgers as well. So that would be stimulus generalization, okay? Stimulus discrimination, on the other hand, is when you stop making the generalized response to one thing and you can discriminate between two different responses. That would be if your response changes, depending on what you like, between hamburger and pizza. Maybe you like pizza more, you drool more. So you have increased drooling and maybe some other kind of response for one type over another. So that would be learn to discriminate between the two different things. You can train a dog to respond differently. This would be a stimulus discrimination training to the sound of a click or to the sound of a bell for two different types of behavior. And that works pretty well. So if the dog learns different commands to different sorts of stimuli, and they know they're going to get a reward, then that's really good, okay? So like I told you last time, I had my Girl Scout trained my dog to play dead by pointing a wand at it and saying Avada Kedavra, like in Harry Potter. So it learns the difference between the different spells and what behavior is expected, and it still gets a reward at the end for doing the behavior. And that's basically how we train animals to do different things and expand on what they can do, because they're doing different things in response to a reward. Extinction is when the animal stops responding for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's bored, maybe, they're sick of the food. The dog is like, yeah, I don't care about your cookies anymore. How about some pieces of meat or something like that? And then it stops responding to the original one, like whatever the original reward was, it's just bored with it now and it doesn't like it anymore. So it stops behaving that way. So you have to find a different sort of reinforcer, one that the dog or animal will like better. So on slide 14, we have the strength of the generalized response. And it shows that, over the different trials, how the curve lessens depending on the stimuli or increases depending on the stimuli as well. So take a look at that chart. Spontaneous recovery can also occur. That's when there was an extinction and, it's been a while, but then the animal does the behavior, or all of a sudden it starts to do the behavior again, and just like it was when it was learning the behavior and was rewarded for it. And it just spontaneously comes back. Then there's higher order conditioning. Higher order conditioning is when you have a strong conditioned stimulus paired with a neutral stimulus. So that would be if you have a bell and snap of a finger, then it's the second thing that will stimulate the same behavior in that animal. And on slide 16, there is a graph for acquisition and extinction, and then no training, and then the extinction curve after that as well. So higher order conditioning is showing the same thing, a snap, like I use the snap, and the metronome with the food. And then pretty soon the metronome can be taken away. That's the thing that it was conditioned to respond to. But now it's changed and it's going to the snap, because the snap represents the metronome. And of course, they're going to get rewarded for their food as well. A conditioned emotional response is an emotional response that's associated with a stimuli. So let's say you are afraid of dogs, and instead of responding in terms of like a reflexive response, like drooling, this is something that happens, it's emotionally. Fear is an emotional response. So if you see a dog and then you're automatically afraid of the dog, that would be a conditioned emotional response for whatever reason, okay? And these are phobias. That's how phobias operate. You've been conditioned in one way or another to respond in fear. It's not just fear. It could be happiness. It could be all kinds of things. But an emotional-based response is a conditional, or a CER, conditional emotional response, okay? Also, there's stimulus substitution. So in Pavlov's original theory, he said that classical conditioning occurred because a conditional stimulus became a substitute for the unconditional stimulus because it was paired closely together. We call that temporal contiguity. Two things occurring together in the same time. Temporal contiguity, okay? So if two things are occurring contiguous in time, then it's going to work. The two things will become associated very closely. So, for instance, at Tiffin, we had a point in our history at Tiffin where we had to get a new jail, and it was overcrowding and things like that. And so we would sentence people for crimes in Tiffin, and we'd say, okay, well, you know you're going to go to jail, and let's say, when will we have room? Maybe next year you'll go to jail for that crime that you committed. Well, that's taking, those two things are not temporally contiguous. Here's the crime, and then the punishment comes way away. So then they stop associating the crime with the punishment, and that's when you have problems. So temporal contiguity is very important in conditioning and in learning theory, because if you don't have two things occurring together, you'll never learn, okay? In the cognitive perspective, we see that classical condition occurs because it gives you information about what's happening. And so you think it through about what to do. So if you're plotting something, and then you sit there and you think about what are the odds of getting caught or something like that, this is how cognitive perspective interprets behavior, okay? So yes, we know that there's a negative punishment coming, but maybe I can get away with it or something like that. That would be a very cognitive way about looking at the unconditional stimulus and the unconditioned response, okay? So conditioned emotional response, as we learned, was a response that's become classically conditioned toward learned stimuli. Okay, you see the dog and then you're afraid of the dog. Vicarious conditioning would be, you don't really need it to happen to you. You can watch it happen to someone else and have that reflexive response. So maybe you're watching a horror show or a documentary where the police set the dogs on someone and the dogs tore the people apart, and then you're sitting there and you're like, oh my God, that could happen. You're having an emotional response, but it's not happening to you. You're watching it and it's happening vicariously. And so that is vicarious conditioning that can happen. So that's another type of learning. I'm going to stop it here, and then we'll get into baby Albert in the next part 2 of learning.